turn it on? Okay, I can
think
do that.
I think I just hit the button. It seems like it's working.
Okay.
Okay. All right, yeah, welcome to the Global Webinars, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm really excited about today's talk, and I hope it'll lead to some really interesting conversations. So today we have, so just to introduce myself, I'm Sean Lovell. I occasionally co-moderate the webinars with Alex and Vanya. So today we have two presenters from the US Census Bureau, Luke Keller and Kate McCall-Kiley. And they are actually co-founders of an emerging technologies R&D group within the US Census Bureau, known as XD. And in case you're curious about XD, they have a website, xd.gov, and you can check that out. So I had the pleasure of working with Luke and Kate on a key innovation project that's been part of our portfolio over the past, I believe, year, more than a year. So I sort of, from the outset, have been really impressed with how they work. It was kind of clear from the outset that this idea of emerging technologies, and I don't want to use a buzzword, but innovation and that sort of thinking wasn't an afterthought in the Census Bureau. It was something they took seriously, and it's something that was deliberate and thoughtful. They always, and it seemed to be just how the agency worked. And so I thought it would be interesting to bring them here so that they could share their thoughts and discuss the key forces that enabled this to happen, and so how they contribute to the work of the agency, and how and maybe perhaps talk about how this could be emulated in other statistical offices and government entities more broadly across our own communities. So this is kind of where I came from. So their talk is going to be, I think what they've discussed, they're going to give a presentation. It's going to be a little bit shorter than usual, and we're going to try to have a decent Q&A session where we talk and have a discussion about what's going on. So before we start, I do want to talk about the speakers themselves, because I find them to be quite interesting individuals on their own merit. So Kate is a co-founder and the director of XD, which is working hard to advance the delivery of data-driven services through new and transformative technologies. She is currently a co-chair developing a national strategy for the United States and around privacy-preserving data sharing and analytics. She's also a research affiliate at MIT and previously served as a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow. Luke is a co-founder of XD and the current Chief Innovation Officer at the US Census Bureau. He's created new mechanisms for hiring top talent through the Emerging Technology Fellowship and is currently leading IT modernization and innovation efforts throughout the Bureau. He previously served as a Presidential Innovation Fellow during the Obama administration. So a few quick things before we jump right in. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. That's probably an easy way to record your thoughts and get things going. During the Q&A session, when we open the floor, it'll be fairly open. So you can raise your hand, we'll call on you, you unmute yourself, and you can just ask it. So that's we'd like to have it be a dialogue. So as you already know, this webinar is being recorded. It'll be made available on the Global Network of Data Officers and Statisticians website at yammer.com/UNstats. We encourage you to continue the conversation on the global network after the webinar. Now over to you, Luke and Kate, take it away.
Thanks, Sean, and everyone for having us. You can see my screen okay?
Yeah, it looks great. Okay,
perfect. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be here and chat with you all today. Again, as Sean mentioned, we're hoping actually this will be pretty short, to be honest, and we'd much rather spend most of the time on questions and discussions and all that. So one, feel free to put your questions in the chat so that we'll have them for the end, but hopefully spend most of the time there. So here, move forward here. Okay, so actually we wanted to start with just a brief context. So as Sean mentioned, both Luke and I have been serving in the US federal government for, I think coming up on 8 years now, which is kind of crazy to say out loud. But as a bit of contextual background, we joined via the White House in the Presidential Innovation Fellowship in 2015. And it was really the height of the innovation startup movement at the time. So for those who don't know, The Obama administration was kind of instrumental in starting this kind of digital services movement, drawing technical talent into government via a set of startups. And the Presidential Innovation Fellows started many of them, actually. And there was this, there was a movement happening that was evolving into take what's working in the private sector, technologically wise, and port it into government. So there's this lot of energy around kind of modernization. So that's to say, what's already kind of working and then porting it into government context. And Luke and I kind of were there saying, okay, this is awesome. This would be really good for certain contexts. But what if those in certain contexts that it might be this kind of hedonic treadmill of technology that was just going to kind of keep getting faster and faster and faster. And to what extent do we need to rethink the treadmill? Was there a case to be made for institutionalizing the experimentation necessary for continually integrating the latest technological advancements and then building that capacity, the capability to do that internally? So we kind of asked this fundamental question, which was, how might we build experimental data products for the public good? We knew that the data landscape was seeing massive shifts, right? We kind of have evidence of that. Let's say it's just even basic survey respondents being down, the aspects of value and that trade-off of user experience and burden becoming more lopsided in these situations. And it was to say, we know the data economy is growing. To what extent will it see disruption in this way? And could we start there as a subset? And essentially, XD started as an experiment to do just this, just to say, could we even do this? And so, at its simplest form, we're just an emerging technologies group. We get together and we say, what could we do that would advance the delivery of data-driven services through new and transformative technologies? So we were thinking it might be fun to basically take you all through what that really has looked like, what we see as our theory of change, the nuts and bolts of how it's worked and how it hasn't worked so far, a specific project example, which will be the one that we've been so lucky to work with Sean and Ronald and others on, and what we see as a few major opportunities in this space as we expand. But does that sound okay? Okay. So to
yeah,
start,
sounds great. Sorry.
Okay, no, yeah, so good. Okay, so to start, basically, has anyone read this book, Orbiting the Giant Hairball? Just like quick chat, or like put your hand up. Okay.
Although I'm going to read it now if you let me order it.
So we love this book. We have both like a reverence and irreverence for it. We reference it quite often, and every new XDer who joins the team gets a copy. So we highly recommend it if you're. It's like a good fun read that you'll finish it in a night or so. But essentially, in it, Gordon McKenzie argues that you could think of traditional orgs as hairballs, and you can think of innovators as like the goal being to orbit the hairball. So in these cases, it basically says a hairball is like this entangled pattern of behavior, right? So for every business process you create or policy you create, you think of that as just like one hairball, one hair that adds to the hairball. And over time, a startup might have, you maybe put one hairball in place, or that's why things can move kind of more quickly. But over time, it becomes this tendency to rely on the past as a formula for the future for future success, which like makes sense, right? It's like a natural human instinct. You've succeeded doing something. And so like naturally our brains just literally form a path that says X equals Y, right? Like if you've done that. So he also argues that as an innovator, right, innovating in traditional orgs is best done if you can think of the org as a hairball and your goal as an innovator is to achieve a perfect orbit, right? It's like not too far that you can't influence it, but not too close that you become it. And we actually thought that this was like pretty inspirational. But one of the things that we have learned over time is that orbit is this constant state of flux. So the decisions that we may have made early on, we would make different decisions now, just based on where we are. And some of the axes in which we thought were really interesting to examine this on were these ideas of modernization, and these ones kept coming up in these contexts, and we're curious to see if like others relate to this. One is modernization and innovation, and the other is kind of fast alone, farther together. And this is probably just like being in a large org of any kind. but especially in government contexts, because sometimes there's literally just one door that you can walk through to open a path. And so we found it like particularly relevant. One of the interesting things here is we also, the modernization piece actually sometimes gets misnamed. So we found that sometimes people are saying innovation, but what they really mean is modernization. So by calling out the tension, right? Let's say just kind of like, we might want to, rethink how we do a website, or, how we put information out to the world. You could argue that's modernization, right? That's like, we should be modernizing our practices to kind of keep up with modern day. Innovation is the extent to which you're creating something totally new. And so while we say it a lot, it's hard sometimes to kind of continually live that. And so one of the things that we did was basically say, okay, if we were to orbit on these axes, like if we were to kind of consistently, where would we land as our defining theory, right? As our defining stance. And we actually came into it saying, okay, well, we should be fast alone and innovative. Like that's just where you would want to be, right? If you're kind of trying to make mass change, this would be a very maybe startup mentality. Ship, break a few things. I think it's a very cultural norm to kind of effuse that. And actually, what has been interesting through this journey is we have found that that's not necessarily the case. We've recently made decisions that were very much modernization and further together recently, and they've been great. Like it's been a large payoff. So what we've noticed is basically you're constantly balancing a tug now of what we'll achieve. So if you're kind of too far off, you might have to we've made some decisions that now pull us closer to the hairball, and then we'll kind of make decisions that will pull us further away. But it's like a constant managing of where we are in space and time. But here's the way we got there was a little bit different. So as we started to define our theory of change, there are basically two main principles, and we tried to narrow it and simplify it as much as we could. The first was lighthouse technology projects. And by this, we mean a technology project that shows the art of the possible. That's just like, oh, we didn't think that could be real. And there's something that shows that it could be real. And the second was top technology talent, right? It's like really, really hard it's really hard to do either without either, which is why this is relatively cyclical. So it's like, to what extent can we create like new talent pools that drive new projects that show new lighthouse technology projects are possible. And weirdly, I think the way out of this chicken and egg situation was actually through a culture norm, right? It was kind of like setting up some levels of culture norms, and that included like new ways of working, right? That might be kind of like relatively foreign to traditional organizations. Census is known as long history of innovative practices, right? Herman Hollerith created the first data tabulator, and they are like kind of this long lineage of really innovative work. And so this was kind of just like layering on things like use of Slack, right? Or kind of cultivating that piece of what makes the Bureau known and well, and kind of invigorated by that sense and thread. So it's rotating existing workforces into some of these projects. It was, the extent to which we could use open source to move a bit more quickly, and staying on top of kind of the ever evolving landscape and knowing kind of which bets to make. So we started to do a lot of the nuance of this pulled out into this theory of change that then started to build on itself to say, okay, if we were to really deliver on this idea of experimental data for the public good, these were going to be kind of like the set of critical components in that theory. And it's not without challenges, and we still actually face these challenges today. And I'll be curious if others, if this resonates with others. Some of them I think will be fairly obvious. One is like designing for risk. So if you're, for us, we're in emerging technologies, which inherently, like by definition, it's risk, right? It's like, there's not a scenario where you can say this is not risk, because you don't know the answer. We really don't know many of the time. So I think what we've managed to do there is emphasize design decisions about managing and communicating risk. So like testing environments, using open data, using existing agreements, and there's kind of like specific ways in which we've managed to almost highlight risk in a way that shows it's naturally part of the process and that we're actively managing it, as opposed to trying to take a position that there isn't any, which I think is sometimes an over habit of traditional orgs or environments of any kind, right? It's just kind of like to say, oh, we just want to eliminate it. The efficiency trap was one that we found that was really interesting. So as you can imagine, in anywhere, there's high operational tax for operating on all kinds of creativity. So this is like agreements take a while, or hiring takes a while, or any of the things that you think of as normal operations that just take time. And I'll admit at first, I think sometimes that meant like there's like an impatience and a frustration that I have, right? I'm like a relatively impatient person, so I'm like, come on, let's go. And I actually, one of the things that we've managed to learn through this challenge is that actually can be a bit of a trap. That sometimes the level of it might actually not seem as if it takes that much, like it actually seems less efficient in the end, but it won't be, to kind of like, this is maybe one of those farther together moments, but kind of trying to time that so that the operational tax that happens, you might pay it up front, but then it's paved, right? And you can kind of ride that road once it's paved, and ideally paved in a really collaborative way. So like, good example of this is like Luke was really instrumental in setting up the XD Emerging Tech Fellowship, which is basically this, right? We'll talk about this, but it's a way that we bring people in that's kind of a totally new hiring vehicle, and is really attractive to top technical talent to come in this way. And it took years, to do. And it was one of those things that I think it was in collaboration with, HR and leadership and other areas, programs in the Bureau to know how to structure it. And Luke just did so much work and time to figure out, okay, the actual efficiency of that is now happening, as opposed to kind of what it took to stand that up. And I guess this probably gets to the last one, which is maybe a philosophical view on one of these challenges. But I can say for myself, it's really tempting to look at it. Like, I think early on, it was really tempting to see this long relay race as like an individual sprint, like for someone who might be coming in to government and, wanting to make an impact or wanting to kind of do a set of work. And then, I think realizing that the scale and pace of government is not my personal pace, right? It's not going to meet my things. It basically means that a suite of interventions dismembers this idea of a solution. Like we haven't found that there's like one solution. It's a suite of ideas. It's usually a group of people. I think the more for me personally that I could see myself as just holding the baton for some period of time that hopefully will pass on just something better to whoever will take this after us. I think then it got kind of much easier to make better organizational decisions, right? Because you look at it as kind of like building out that sustainability. So quick nuts and bolts. These are like very specific and in the weeds, but we figured this might actually be kind of interesting for folks. This is just when we thought about the early days we're building this ship. Building XD was really starting with culture. So we mentioned this. We kind of did. I'll let you guys read this. This is like in depth, and you'll have a copy of it. But basically, what's kind of interesting about this is, what it doesn't say here is this is a ton of failure. This is 2 brands later. We went through 2 brands. We revised our mission statement 3 times. I think there's some core tenets to what we did to set up the org, meaning like aligning with programs' biggest challenges, or creating blending funding models so that we're able to diversify where that comes from. And then obviously the hiring mechanisms that we mentioned, and just kind of like setting down some of those really important infrastructural moves, like operationally infrastructural moves. But we're happy to talk about any of the stuff at this part where we're tripping over ourselves and just trying to figure out, what's going to work and what's not, what's important to lay in this stage, and what's superfluous. And then hitting some level of escape velocity, which basically I think felt to me a lot like what I think it would feel in a rocket ship. It's just mostly like, holy crap, hang on, and it's like stuff is shaking, and they're basically trying to grow, right? Trying to get a sense of demand, and we kind of have people, and you could argue there's some aspects of this that are like some that we might still be experiencing some of this in some ways. But part of this that really, I think, sent us into escape philosophy, some of the key things that we did. And Luke, I'd be curious if you have things here too. But for me, I think one of the things that really helped us achieve that escape velocity was partnering directly with key places around the Bureau. So, just like huge testament to our Chief Information Officer, Louis Cano, and Bo Hausers, our Chief Information Security Officer. Like, we partnered directly on deployments. And or we partnered directly with the policy office, because we could tell really early on in some of this stuff, and we'll go through the example and you'll kind of see why. But as you start to get the sense that some of these emerging technologies are naturally going to hit up against policy, they're going to hit up against existing policies and what data access means, or data, or some of the natural products of data governance and what our positions are, or legal frameworks. They're definitely hitting up against, what does it mean to be in a testing environment versus production, for setting up like a network node inside of our infrastructure. And so I think one of the things that really, or some of the other areas around the Bureau, we have a whole suite of projects with other program areas, and I think these are the types of things that really sent us on the rocket ship. They lit the fire underneath, I think, and propelled us into like a different level of support. I don't know, Luke, do you have anything that I'm missing there?
No, I don't think there's anything you missed, Kate. I really do think, though, that one thing that's very interesting about this journey that's perhaps like not captured so clearly without like knowing like the full kind of depth and history of XD is kind of a shift in, as Kate mentioned, kind of like a series of failures that kind of led to an understanding of how to be most effective. And so, when Kate's talking about partnering with our Chief Information Office, right? Like if we like circle back to like this concept of orbit, what that means is like working with folks who are like in the absolute center of the organization, who play like a significant governance role in how work happens at the Bureau. So then you have to ask yourself this question as like a unit or a team that's trying to kind of like push the boundaries of the possible. It's like, how do you kind of navigate that relationship without, kind of becoming, sort of like this centralized entity that's kind of reducing your appetite for risk in order to, make compromises to get projects launched. Like, you have to define your risk appetite. You have to define what principles you can and can't compromise on to get projects launched. It's a very fascinating kind of tension to navigate. And, I think ultimately, I think what one of the things that's been most effective in kind of that shift is that we have data over 5 years, or I should say we have experience over 5 years that kind of shows us that when we kind of had this like too cool for school kind of approach, where, like we were trying to hire folks that, brilliant technology talent to kind of come to the Bureau and just give us their best ideas and launch them by ourselves, we realized that wasn't sustainable. And even though this is an innovation team and an innovation unit trying to do really fantastic forward-thinking work, you can't do that without working with folks in the present. And on top of that, one of the things that I've learned, working at XD is that while this may be a team focused on innovation, it's not to say that, other areas of the enterprise don't have as much of a mind towards innovation as well, meaning that our Chief Information Officer and others in his area are quite forward thinking. And the only reason we've been successful so far in some of those projects is because they see the same things that we see. I think the difference is that XD has kind of built itself and structured itself to focus more of its time on those things, whereas they're kind of weighing their priorities of innovation against so many of the modernization challenges that they face every day. So, Kate, that's probably the only thing I would add there.
Yeah, and I think it's a great segue into like now what in some ways a lot of our time is spent on, I think, this idea of orbiting, which is like, again, managing this consistent tension between being too far out, right, and like not being able to come back into that, or being too close, and both happen. And I think just like understanding that both happen for us has been a really nice realization. So actually, we'll go into a case study. Luke, do you want to kind of go through quickly the case study aspect of this is the privacy enhancing technologies work that we've been doing with Sean and Ronald and others.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kate. Do you want to go to the next slide? So I think what's really nice about kind of going from this very high level picture to a case study is that you're hopefully going to get some sense of, how does this translate into project work? And one of the things that we didn't cover in this presentation is that a lot of our what we're going to describe here is actually the result of years of work, not just with UN Pet Lab and kind of others in the international community, but way back, several years ago, this idea, kind of looking at, I think as Kate mentioned, kind of dropping self-response rates on a lot of our surveys and asking this question of what does the future of data acquisition at census look like? What is what are our future data products look like if we might not be able to rely on self-response? It's this kind of existential crisis, I think, in a larger statistical context that we may be facing in our respective organizations. And we were privy to those conversations and kind of thinking about what roles can technology play in this? And this is where we essentially ask this question of ourselves, right? If we have all these kind of stringent requirements about what data we can and can't access and what access means, let's step back and think very high level, right? What if we could answer questions using data that we never see? A lot of the kind of constraints about data access in a government context, right, is this notion of trust. And there's a lot of a big sort of subset of questions and challenges that are presented by census even being a sort of data provider and owning certain data sets or kind of ingesting certain data sets and what that means in a kind of governance context. And it seems like one of the best questions to then ask of ourselves really as an organization is how can we get the best data, the most timely, the most accurate, most granular data, if we will, about our economy and our people. And to Kate's point earlier, right, we're seeing the data economy kind of mature tremendously. As self-response rates dwindle, we're also seeing the amount of data available in the world exponentially increasing every day. And so it seems like the answer to the challenge then is how do we get access to that data, right? And it seems like privacy enhancing technologies, and specifically privacy enhancing technologies with a network component, may be an opportunity to do just that. And so what we've been doing over the last, I would say, year and a half or so now, specifically with the UN Pet Lab, has been exploring what this might look like on an international stage. And so we've been one of several countries participating in a pilot to essentially use well, I'll talk about this in a little bit, the platform itself, but essentially using a privacy enhancing, network privacy enhancing technology solution to connect with other countries in the international community. And for now, we've really just kept a focus on trade data, specifically open trade data. The sort of the trade-off, if you will, that we're thinking about in selecting a data set for participation in this pilot is how can we kind of focus our efforts on specific challenges that we want to solve for at this stage, while also having an eye for the challenges that we would need to solve for in the future. And so because we're already publishing open data and because it's an international project, it seemed to, in the trade community, it seemed to make a lot of sense that we would, at first, at least kind of de-risk the sort of private data component of the project, and instead just emphasize the function of what a network might look like and the value that it provides. And so this is essentially like a rough architecture of what this looks like. What we're trying to accomplish is allowing folks from the international community, specifically those with data science, Python expertise, to query a research network, if you will, where the United Nations, and then the Pet Lab specifically, and Sean, feel free to jump in at any point, by the way, if you need to put me back on the correct path there. But the UN Pet Lab essentially serves as this what we're calling a network node function. It's essentially like a sort of a centralized entity within this larger research network, where many of the domain nodes kind of are able to discover one another and communicate with one another in it. And so if a data scientist is able to essentially authenticate with this network node, they authenticate with a larger research network where they can query data throughout the network. You go ahead to the next slide, Kate. One of the fascinating things about a network pet solution, and the one that we're using specifically is PySift, is that we're trying to explore a number of privacy enhancing technology challenges within this project. So Census has a long and storied history in the deferential privacy space. I'm sure many of you know. And PySift has its own DP kind of implementation that it's rolled out in this to achieve a level of output privacy that's required, in particular in kind of a research context here. But what's so interesting is that this isn't just about one type of privacy, right? What we're trying to look at is also exploring input privacy as part of this research network as well. So how do you get a lot of these countries to kind of participate in a kind of joint research network, kind of confident that their data is not going to be disclosed inadvertently to another country participating, right? Even though we're using open data, the goal ultimately is to kind of get to a stage or maturity in this implementation where we can feel comfortable using private data. And so PySIF, leverages secure multi-party computation to achieve that input privacy component. That is to say that like each, kind of data provider is able to provide data, and a data scientist can query the network, and essentially without knowing all the contributions of the different actors and from a data perspective in that space, they're able to query all that data and get a response to a query that they make. So this is a query-based network. If you haven't kind of discerned that yet, essentially what it means is we're able to answer or data scientists is able to answer simple questions about information or rather they're able to answer simple questions about trade data that we're including in this pilot. So in our case, we're using, again, open trade data. So this would be import-export data. And so data scientists interested in learning more about what's happening in the international community from a trade perspective would be able to query this network and get answers to that based on the data provided by the different participating countries. I think one of the really interesting things, and again, Sean, feel free to jump in at any point if you want to, because I'm just going to keep rolling. I think one of the interesting things about this pilot, though, and again, kind of going back to like this concept of orbit and how you work with others at the Census Bureau, is that what we discovered is that in some perhaps smaller organizations, you might be able to kind of ride the benefit of a pilot and stand up a lot of this technical infrastructure before kind of getting into deep governance challenges when it comes to how your bureaucracy or enterprise kind of governs IT systems. What we discovered, though, is that at Census, since we're a rather large and mature statistical organization, there are lots of different governance structures that have kind of jurisdiction over this pilot. And so we had to be very selective and very careful about what we wanted to test and when. Otherwise, we'd be inundated with governance from all angles of this project. And we didn't believe that the work could really sustain and prove value if we attempted to kind of tackle all of the governance challenges. So in particular, I'm speaking to like the IT governance challenges. So what it means to kind of launch a production system or even a system that connects to another country. That in and of itself is a well-known and significant problem in the US government. It kind of manifests itself in what's called an ATO, or an authority to operate. Essentially, it's a procedure you have to go through to get approval to launch a system that is deemed a production system. And in our case, we weren't able to say this is a sandbox, it's open data. And the reason for that is because even though it's open data, we were having international, members of the international community access a US government system. And so there's no scenario where they would say, yeah, that's a sandbox system, don't worry about it. So we had to go through this kind of production type evaluation of our system. And so that's why we essentially made the decision, well, we understand that that's going to be a significant challenge now. So we're going to focus on open data so we can avoid the data governance kind of component of this project and get into that once we figure out the IT governance challenges here. And so what we've tried to do, kind of embodying the principles of XD and kind of having so one foot in the door of experimentation, but one foot in the door of modernization, if you will, is thinking about, how do we sustain these systems over time and learn enough from this implementation that we can do this again and again in other research contexts. And so one of the things we've leaned on is this, implementing zero trust principles, if you will, in this pilot, which allowed us to essentially insulate, anything that's happening within this particular implementation from the larger census network. So all this to say, kind of like zooming out a little bit, I think what's fascinating about this project is that there's so many wonderful questions that we could ask about privacy enhancing technologies, and specifically network privacy enhancing technologies at Census. One of the most significant kind of limitations of kind of the work that the US Census Bureau has done historically is that we've really kind of played this kind of almost like a asynchronous relationship with our larger statistical community and kind of customers of our data, which is to say that Census kind of traditionally has a data product and it publishes a data product. And typically, because of all the limitations and kind of confidentiality type restrictions and things, if you will, that the Census Bureau has to abide by in order to protect the data of our country's businesses and our people, we've been very limited in the kinds of kind of the fidelity of the data that we can publish. And so typically our data kind of manifests in either open data or private data. And private data, of course, is very hard to access at the Census Bureau. You have to go through a very lengthy kind of procedure to actually gain access to that. And it's for good reason, right? But what privacy enhancing technologies, specifically networking ones, may introduce is this notion that we can reduce the barriers to access more valuable data from the Census Bureau. Even with DP, even with noise injection, there's more value that can be presented by that data than anything we've ever done before, potentially. And so that's probably, I would say, like one of the most exciting things about this work, and why I think like XD is very well poised to be kind of like the team driving at least some of this work at the Census Bureau, because there's also some other areas of the Bureau that explore different components of the privacy enhancing technology challenges that we face. Next slide. Sorry, it's not loading for me. Could you go to the, yeah, thank you very much. So I hope that was helpful and illuminating in terms of like how XD's kind of philosophy and kind of design translates into projects. And we're more than happy to talk about that in the Q&A. There's lots that we could say about like how projects kind of mature to a point where we're willing to talk about them. We're also willing to talk about all the projects that haven't worked. There's a lot of really great work there. But all this to say, I think like as learnings from that case study that we just described, we're seeing a few different opportunities. So I spoke to one of them already. It's this notion that like what happens when the Census Bureau's data is more sort of intertwined or capable of being kind of connected to other data sets at the US government, outside the US government, internationally. And we think privacy enhancing technologies could be quite critical, specifically networking ones, to making that possible. Next slide. So in addition, XD kind of being founded on this notion of how might we build experimental data products, again, like one thing I think that this project and other projects that XD is working on is really this notion of continuing to kind of push our organization's culture, being the Census Bureau, towards one that is more comfortable with and embracing of this notion of experimentation, and really trying to find new mechanisms, not just from an IT perspective or from a data governance perspective, but also new authorities and new capabilities that many different federal agencies in the U.S. government have been able to tap into for other kind of innovation programs. So thinking about ways that we can leverage all the available kind of tools, if you will, under kind of like an innovation umbrella to continue this really great work. Next slide. And then lastly, one thing that's really interesting, I think, about the privacy enhancing technology portfolio that's probably less explored now, but something that we could explore more in the future is the notion of participatory governance. We've seen some really great work with other partners at the Census Bureau, or rather other areas of the Census Bureau have been working on to kind of open up the kind of black box of how a lot of these decisions are made. I think there's some really important questions being asked in kind of a larger data ecosystem, if you will, about how data is used. And Census, and the U.S. government generally, to an extent, has done a tremendous amount of work in the open data space, and even in kind of publishing, the sort of metadata of its private data, if you will, on research.data.gov, I think, for example, research.data.gov.org. But there's still a lot of work that could be done in terms of really trying to understand like how we actually are using individuals' data. We're seeing a lot of really interesting work in the health space, here too. And so I think there's this question of like, is there a component to the network privacy enhancing technology problem that encourages participatory governance? So what does that look like? What kinds of actors outside of government, would be highly engaged in that problem? What kinds of organizations would kind of play a really key function in ensuring that, that we're doing best by our people, right? And best by, our sort of principles and the laws and kind of regulations that essentially ensure that the Census Bureau is using, private data in a way that's quite responsible. Kate, I don't know if there's the same thing that you wanted to add there.
Yeah, I mean, it's been what's kind of cool about this is like if we assume some level of baseline data networking in the future, what's been so cool is to see so many people like raise their hand to be a part of that, right? Like making sure that moves much more towards like an equitable state, and that kind of like national statistical organizations and others have a large hand in that. So for example, we have this emerging technology fellowship, and we're seeing people from all over raise their hands to like come work on this. So it's really, really cool to kind of see the natural extension of some of this work and the level of interest from like a highly motivated generation to like be deployed against these types of problems. So I think not even just within our walls to extend that, but beyond. We've been so encouraged to see so many great folks being willing to kind of spend their time on data innovation now and of the future. And I guess that's where we're some. We have some. Yeah, Luke, do you have one more?
Yeah, I would do. I just want to make a few plugs here before we jump into Q&A. So one is that I think what's really exciting about the privacy enhancing technology work is that XD is exploring a number of pilots. So the UN Pet Lab is our oldest, most mature, I think, engagement, but I think there are other opportunities to participate as well. So if you are a statistical organization and you're excited to work with the US Census Bureau, please reach out. We can drop our email in the chat. If you want to just learn more about XD generally and learn more about our work in privacy enhancing technologies, and you think there's an opportunity for partnership even, we'd love for you to reach out. So that's plug one. The other plug I would make is that, Kate mentioned a few times the Emerging Technology Fellowship. It's XD's kind of like core talent acquisition vehicle. It's a way for us to bring really amazing private sector talent and talent from outside government into the government on kind of what we're calling civic tours of duty, if you will. It's a fellowship type model where we recruit cohorts annually, and this is now the second year. And we still have applications open for the current cohort for the Emerging Technology Fellowship. They close, I think, Thursday at midnight Eastern Standard Time. So if you know anyone that's a wonderfully talented privacy engineer, AI, machine learning engineer, data scientist, you name it, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to have them apply. There's more information at xd.gov/apply if anyone's interested. It is restricted to U.S. citizens just because that's generally a component of working in the U.S. federal government, unfortunately. But nonetheless, if you do know anybody that meets that criteria that I just described, like we'd love to have them apply. So those are the two plugs I would make before our Q&A. We're happy to talk about any and all projects, anything we just mentioned here, anything we didn't mention here. If you have questions about, XD generally or the US Census Bureau and innovation at the Bureau, we're happy to chat about that too. Whatever you think about, whatever your heart desires, we're happy to discuss.
Excellent. Thanks so much, guys. I got to say, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I look forward to the Q&A session. One thing I think I have to do, I want to unmute all. I think, Alex, you did that.
I've done
awesome.
that.
Thanks. So everyone is, you can turn on your cameras if you want. You can ask questions. If you don't mind, I'll ask the first question just to kick it off. I actually was really curious about one aspect, and to not draw too fine a point on it, I wanted to say, in my experience, it can almost seem like the broader policy environment is almost like structured in such a way that it's designed to prevent innovation. And I wanted to ask if this is something that you recognize in your agents in the Bureau. And I'm really curious to what extent this was the case. Did the policy environment kind of present itself as just this giant roadblock? Were there people there who are your allies that could unblock it? And so that whole process of being enabled to work, I think, is something that I recognize in my work. And to the extent that people have been there to help me out, that's been a critical enabler for me. I just wanted to, it sounds like you guys have just been massively successful. So I wanted to hear, maybe there's a story behind that. I don't know.
Yeah, I can start, and Luke, let me know if you have other things. But basically the TLDR is rotate a policy expert onto the team.
Oh, okay.
So basically what we did was, we had policy experts in these spaces. We could tell right off that basically it was going to challenge traditional policy notions of data access, right? Like ingestion, all these kind of, maybe even hitting up against, Title 13, Title 26, which is our laws that govern that stuff. So yeah, we said basically, let's just rotate them on to literally be charged with solving those alongside technical folks.
Yeah, I think I would add there, our policy office generally has been really quite supportive of this work. And I think the reason is that I think what's so exciting, particularly on the privacy enhancing technology front, what's so exciting about it is that it's actually an opportunity to de-risk our current operations and how we query data, right? Like if there was a full kind of adoption of the entire suite of kind of currently available privacy enhancing technologies, and we felt that they were, let's just call them production ready, right? It would essentially allow for even our internal enterprises to be radically transformed to kind of reduce what we call data access and kind of emphasize this like need to know type of access component for a lot of Bureau staff and even outside members of the statistical communities that are customers of our data. And so I think in a way it actually is an opportunity, despite kind of introducing risk in different ways, like technically and other, ultimately, I think if successful, this portfolio of work could actually de-risk our current operations. And so I think that's very attractive to folks from a policy context, right? Like there are better ways to kind of manage our data access practices, right? And privacy enhancing technologies can certainly be a significant part of that story. And to Kate's point, like rotating somebody in from policy, what we found is that policy is in the business of kind of de-risking our operations, and they kind of get a bad rap for being an organization that just says no. And I think we've come to understand that they say no for very good reasons. like really having somebody on the team to kind of educate us, we realize that it's not just about like getting around things, but actually like meaningfully engaging with the reasons that we get no, and instead trying to find out like what would it take to get to a yes, and kind of establishing like a set of requirements from a technical perspective that can help fulfill like our policy blockers. So it's been really helpful having somebody on the team with that really deep policy expertise to help inform how these projects develop.
That's excellent. That's great. So I could go into, I have more questions on that, but I wanted to give other people a chance to speak up. I see there have been a couple of people have turned on their cameras. Is there anybody from the audience who'd like to poke around, ask some questions, get a feel for what's going on? So one thing, one thing I guess that stands out just while we're waiting for people. I see Alex has a question in the chat here. Alex, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just wondering about one thing, because part of the innovation process that you're basically have established with XD is also to change the hiring process. And hiring process is one of those things which is governed by very strict rules for very good reasons, right? So I'm just curious to hear a little bit how you were able to basically get those HR people on board and maybe soften or change some of those hiring rules. Maybe you can say something about that. Thanks.
Yeah, Kate, do you mind if I take this one? So this was a really interesting journey for us. Kate mentioned very early on the presentation that this all started in 2015 when we joined the Presidential Innovation Fellowship. We joined like within a week of each other. So we've been working together for the last 7 years. And one of the things that we learned from that program and from others in this space who have been working, way back and even, around 2010 or before that, is that there's, in the US government, there's this really unique hiring authority that was seldom leveraged, but is now growing in implementation, which is called Schedule AR. A is kind of a non-competitive hiring authority, and the subsection R essentially states that you can use this non-competitive hiring authority if you establish a fellowship program. It doesn't define what a fellowship program is. It's in like we had to read the legislation. We had to really understand like what does it mean to establish this, and like what are the specific kind of components of that subsection, which is I think maybe 4 sentences long. Like what does it require of us in order to use what's called a non-competitive hiring authority? And that non-competitive piece is really important because you can use traditional hiring authorities, competitive hiring authorities of the U.S. government to hire great people, and the U.S. government everywhere is doing that. But what we wanted in order to kind of establish this subculture that Kate was describing, really this like team with a really unique kind of perspective on innovation, experimentation, we wanted a non-competitive hiring authority that allowed us to act a little bit more quickly to respond to kind of like an emerging landscape of continuing evolving technical trends. And so in order to do that, we found that this subsection R of this like non-competitive hiring authority allowed us to establish a fellowship. The downside of it is that the fellowship only allows us to, the fellowship model, I should say, only allows us to hire individuals for up to 4 years of service. But the funny thing about fellowships in the US government is that we've looked at kind of information from other fellowship programs structured in a similar way. And what we found is that around more than half of folks that come through what are only supposed to be a 4-year term continue to stay. They find ways. So you come in the front door as a fellow, and you kind of stay by finding another role in the US government that kind of matches your work experience when you kind of served as a fellow. And so, when we saw that, it was quite encouraging. And so it took us about 2 years working with HR to really build this thing from the ground up, because Census, didn't have this process for defining what a fellowship was and what makes something a fellowship versus not. At first, we had kind of this authority, 3 years ago, where we were just like, okay, like we're a fellowship, sure. We just like hired people. We didn't have cohorts, and we didn't have a brand for it. We didn't call it anything. We just used it. And then HR said, like, hang on a second, like, you can't do that. You have to make like an actual fellowship, like for this to be, a fellowship. So then we had to go back to the, the drawing board and actually spin up a proper fellowship, put some healthy definitions around it, put it in a cohort, kind of model. And the one thing I thought was really encouraging about it, despite it being quite a challenging journey to work with folks and work through like the legal and policy implications of standing up a fellowship, was that I believe that standing up a program in a cohort type model actually makes the opportunity more attractive for folks in the private sector. Because, to Kate's point earlier, like what it really encourages is building a strong culture, right? Like when you're kind of joining just to join, right, without any kind of end date on your term, that's a very different experience and perspective than saying, you're coming to to join the XD team for a limited time. You have up to 4 years. Like, what are you going to do in that 4 years, with your talent? I think that's a far more compelling question to ask of a group of individuals that are kind of being framed as folks with like a rare technical expertise to join the U.S. government than just being somebody who's meant to kind of work on a particular problem endlessly. And so it actually, in a way, like the limitations of the fellowship model actually create an opportunity for us to strengthen the cultural, the cultural kind of element of that XD is trying to build.
Excellent. That's really, so almost putting it mission driven at the outset. The people come in and they're put right to the. So yeah, so actually we have another question from Madhavan. If you don't mind, Madhavan, would you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Hi. So, hey, Luke, good meeting you again from the Slack community. I was just wondering, there is this thing called the White House NAIR community, NIRR. So, is this pet project, in what to say, infancy, or is it, in a good maturity state? Will it be coming back to NAIR, or it is going to stay back with the Census Bureau thinking? That's my first question. Second question is, how are you, managing this key encryption thingy with the pet community? Because key encryption is, one of those, what to say, important topics when it goes around with the privacy topics. So, thank you.
So I had a little trouble hearing you on those questions, but I think the first question was about a White House effort and the maturity of the privacy enhancing technologies portfolio. Kate, I'm not sure if you wanted to answer.
Agree.
Okay.
Go ahead.
He said agree. Yeah.
Okay. Kate, did you want to answer that from XD's perspective, or would you like me to take that question? Because I'm happy to. If it's up to you.
Yeah. Well, so we can't speak to anything specific to White House initiatives, although, they've put out a series of executive orders and kind of, been really supportive of the adoption of privacy enhancing technologies more broadly, which has been really, of course, really helpful for us on the agency level to, as we kind of like work on the ground to get things done. And then I would say on the maturity of the PES portfolio, I mean, obviously Luke talked about how the UN pilot is kind of one of the more mature pilots in the portfolio, but the reason why we structure things as portfolios is for exactly this reason, right? It's so that you can say there's going to be some projects and pilots in a portfolio that are more mature than others. There's going to be some things where you're going to where they're just less, right? Like maybe the technology is less mature, maybe it's just more of a risky bet. And so you'd structure it in a portfolio to say, all right, well, let's shut that part down. That part didn't work. Let's do this. But you're not kind of bound. You're not saying it's a project that definitely has to continue no matter what. So it's kind of the reason why we structure it that way. And actually, this actually gets to one of the other questions in the chat, if I might, which is, I think it's Abrash's question, which is technology requires big initial investment and it's obsolete fast. This is exactly what we're trying to break, right? We're trying to say, like, how do you break that? How do you make it the least initial investment? And understand if you can shut it down really quickly. And so a portfolio, how we structure it as a portfolio is basically to say, how do you decrease costs as much as possible to try to get at if the core technology is going to be worth actually investing in or not? Like, that's our kind of functional role within Census, right? It's to say, okay, we're going to test the thing so that the org knows we should make this investment. This is worth it, right? It's paid off in here and here, or it doesn't, and we shouldn't. And so when policymakers or IT go to make that investment, hopefully they have an actual pilot to point to say, oh, we tried this thing. It's not just kind of that we're assessing it. It's less about convincing them, right? It's more about saying, how do we do this at like next to no cost? How do we use open source where we can? how do we use feds where we can, right? Like, it's a lot of what we've done is to try to balance that sheet into low cost initially, and then manage the investment after that.
So, Kate, one thing I just want to add here is that I was looking up what was put in the chat, like the context about the National Artificial Intelligence Research Resource Task Force. While we're not directly involved, I think, in that task force, one of the co-chairs, actually, we've worked with two of the different co-chairs. So, Kate works often with Tessa Blanc-Knowles on a different kind of national strategy for privacy enhancing technologies that we've been working on for a long time. We're hoping that will roll out soon. So XD's work has been really instrumental to informing the development of that strategy, specifically around like the opportunity landscape, as well as like how federal agencies might perceive the kind of the risk of working in this space, and how they might kind of use XD as a model for kind of getting involved. So that's one component. And then there's other components I think that we've been working with OSTP on that are a bit less mature on the use case side, but we're exploring other opportunities for international collaboration for pets outside of what's happening at the UN Pet Lab. I know there's also been like other great work too. There's like the US UK Prize Challenge in pets that we've been privy to, but not in any way kind of driving. So we're pretty, I would say like we're relatively plugged in the pet space generally, but I don't think we've been summoned formally for this research resource task force, if that's helpful context.
I love the use of the word summon there.
I mean, that's kind of how
formally like how actually, and then I can try to take a crack at the other two questions quickly if it's helpful. I'm seeing one: how do you balance technology with the UN fundamental principles of official statistics? So I would say basically where we tend to really like tech, right? But we ultimately we see it in service of all these other things, right? Like technology is just in service of of the mission of the Bureau, of the mission of the US, of the statistical organizations more broadly. So anything we do, I think, we're trying to align it with these principles and guiding principles. And we just see technology as like one piece of contributing to that. And then the other is around the theory of change and maybe sharing what you think is your greatest achievement so far. And I love this question because I'm like curious, Luke, how you would answer this. I think that there's like, it's kind of weird because I'm like, oh man, there's so much to do, and I never really think about what we've managed to achieve or what would be great about that. But I think for me, maybe one of the more inspirational parts about my day is like seeing super talented people raise their hand to join the mission, right? Like they're taking pay cuts, that they are gonna they're joining knowing they're landing on planet government where things are just gonna be harder. All right, it's going to be harder to stand up a website. It's going to be harder to set up a server. It's going to be harder to do all those things, and they raise their hand to do it. And it's because they really believe in what we're trying to do and furthering data innovation for the public good. So it's hard to think that wouldn't be one of it's certainly the thing that keeps me going every day when stuff gets hard. But Luke, what would you say is our greatest achievement so far?
Yeah, I would, I don't think there's a shortage of great ideas. I think there's a shortage of great people. And it's not to say that they're not out there. It's just, how do you get them in? I think that was like one of the most significant challenges that the XD team had to solve for. And I think the Emerging Tech Fellowship is one component of that. One thing that doesn't get as emphasized with XD that I think is really exciting, and this kind of goes back to that like question of orbit, is its Emerging Tech Rotation program that Kate had briefly mentioned. And one of the things I love about that so much is that, while bringing in private sector talent is really important, I think it's also really important to acknowledge the skills that you have in your current, statistical organization, and creating opportunities for those folks to kind of opt in and learn more and, kind of provide more value to your organization. Because realistically, those folks have already signed up. They've already said, I believe in your mission. I support the work that you're doing, and I want to help. And I think we do a disservice to our workforce when we don't create opportunities for folks to opt in, right? Like that's one of I think the core components of like XD's culture. It's like we really expect people to get excited about projects, and we expect them to drive those projects that they're excited about. Like there's a set of projects that folks kind of come in and work on that are part of years long efforts to kind of mature a set of portfolios and ideas and concepts. But ultimately, our expectation is like, if there's something that folks are passionate about that they want to learn more about, pitch it, right? Like go find funding for it. We can help you find funding for it. We want people to opt in. And I think that when you create opportunities, not just for outside folks to join like an innovation unit and do wonderful work, but you create opportunities for folks inside of your organization to also join in on that work. I think what you're showing is that, you're not building an ivory tower of innovation and experimentation. Rather, like your goal truly is to kind of infuse this like cultural shift towards, the possibilities that technology can kind of bring in your mission delivery. So all that's to say that I think that the thing I'm most excited about with the theory of change is the talent component. And again, we recruit annually, so this is only our second time, and we're seeing some really fantastic and encouraging numbers this time for the Emerging Technology Fellowship. And theory of change is kind of our theory of change specifically is a loose collection of ideas that we see have some relationship to one another. And I'm really excited to see just how well that pans out over the next few years. But so far, what we've seen up to this point, at least, has been very encouraging. Kate, there's a question in the chat from Sean about how COVID-19 influenced our work.
Although, are we at time?
Oh yeah, we are at time. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, we can end soon if you wanted to answer it. This was from Ronald, actually. He was curious about this.
Oh, okay. I mean, we're good. I just want to make sure other people, like, if you got stuff to, we don't hold up. But yeah, no, it's been interesting. I mean, I think for us, actually, COVID-19 hasn't actually inhibited the work, I would say. If anything, it kind of like was able to, I mean, so we were a remote team basically before this. So I think there's some aspects of that kind of really help on the talent component where that became a norm as part of that, in recruiting and stuff like that. And then I think, I think any crisis of any kind just kind of forces a rethink, right? Like it kind of naturally forced every human to rethink their life, for better or worse. And so I think as part of that, for us, I think that manifested in lots of ways, but for the most part, I think we've been really, really lucky to see, great people raising their hands and the org moving towards, more remote work and embracing kind of things that we might not have otherwise, just because we see the world kind of moving so fast now in other directions. Yeah.
So I think we're at time, I believe. I had one more question. I'm going to selfishly ask it because I'm the moderator.
Yeah.
But I wanted to get a feel for the the GS 15. So one thing I wanted to point out is that this fellowship that you're offering, you talked about the challenges in acquiring talent and this and that. So what the decision? So the GS 15 pay that you're offering at this fellowship is the highest level in the federal government. I just wanted to have a conversation around that. To maybe was this something that was ever controversial? Because I'm coming from the UN side. If we were hiring, we certainly wouldn't give them a D2 salary, which is very high for us. So how did this conversation go regarding the decision to give them the highest possible pay in the organization? I mean, because that seems like a very deliberate choice. It's to say we want to get the best and the brightest, and we're going to put money where our, whatever the analogy is, we're gonna really stand behind that decision. Whereas I feel a lot of teams say we want to hire the best and the brightest, and we bring them in at a very junior level or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating question. So I'm going to do my best to not go on like a long tangent about all the challenges of hiring the U.S. government. At a high level, I would say that there is a significant disconnect in the way that we structure pay in the US government relative to the way that the private sector views what levels of experience coincide with what level of pay by industry. So I think like historically, like the US government wasn't that far off, but ever since like the kind of tech boom of 2000, like we've really struggled to keep up with the pay and compensation of individuals joining the private sector to work with tech-driven startups in particular, and even large kind of tech enterprises like Apple, Microsoft, you name it. And that's been significantly challenging. And oddly enough, what it has kind of resulted in is this notion that it's actually, I would argue that it's easier to hire mid-level plus talent from the tech sector in the US government than it is to hire junior talent, just because, again, like the kind of pay is not even close for kind of entry level, not even entry level, but folks kind of leaving a grad school program with technical expertise compared to the level of pay offered by GS15 and the kind of the experience requirements, to kind of achieve that sort of qualification, if you will. And so the deliberate decision that we made was, what does it take for someone to qualify as a GS15? And essentially the answer to that is you have to have at least a year of experience at the GS14 level. But what does that even mean if someone has no government experience, right? And so we had to work with our partners in HR to kind of say what we're looking for is really talented folks that would get paid very well in the private sector, that have some level of senior expertise, kind of working on technology projects outside of government. So whether that be a technical lead on a project or managing a team or whatever it might be, we believe that, that's what it would take for individual to qual. And we kind of we kind of agreed with, HR that we believe that that's what that qualification standard should be defined as. And I think the decision that we made as a team was that, being a very small team, what we wanted to do was emphasize hiring senior talent to tackle these kind of big, wicked, ambiguous, sticky challenges, if you will. And then, what we did though, behind the scenes, what we haven't kind of put out there yet, is that what we've done is we've created actually a fellowship that supports other pay levels too. So we can go all the way down to the GS13 level, which is, a little bit more junior, but still relatively senior. And then we've created essentially a pathway for folks that if they do join at that level, we can move them up from the GS13 to the 14 to the 15 in what's called, I believe it's called pathways in the US government, which is, again, an ability for someone to kind of join at a specific level and be on an expedited path to kind of gain promotions through the different grades, if you will. This was a very deliberate decision because our belief was that at the very least, if you join the US government, you should be well positioned to kind of qualify for senior positions, either at census or beyond. There's a real lack of technical talent at the kind of at the sort of critical moments that tech decisions are made in the US government. We've seen just historically, that, that talent is very needed when making key decisions about our data and our products and things of that nature. And we hope that this fellowship is a vehicle for kind of bringing that talent in the door, whether it's the actual folks that are currently serving as fellows or the positions they take when they're done serving in this fellowship. So yeah, that was a very deliberate decision that we want to bring in senior folks for a lot of different reasons. And, I think if we're successful in the next few years, we're able to kind of look at the other lower grades too and see just how far can we go? Can we bring in folks that are a little bit more junior? Because we don't want to just create opportunities for folks that are seasoned experts. We want to create opportunities for folks, that have, a year or two of experience outside of school to join the US government and, and have a wonderful fellowship experience as well. So that's something we're going to be exploring over the next few years. Kate, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, and I think, if you're someone who's thinking about doing something like this, like Sean, like you mentioned, you're okay, some of us might say, okay, we want to do this thing, but then we end up slotting them into more junior roles, right? And it's I think for us, we genuinely looked at all of this like an experiment. We were okay, will the people that we would want to come if this were the case, right? And it's our guess is no. Our guess is that you need to give them that 15 in order to really get them to come. And, there's some parts of that are paying off, but I would encourage everybody, for the thing that you really want to do, just test it. Just be will somebody come that will the standard that I want come if this is the role that we slot them into, right?
Yeah.
And if the answer is no, you gotta change it. You gotta.
One thing I want to say before we go, this is not to sabotage the conversation, but we are going to do a poll in the chat. We want to get a feel for how you appreciate the webinar. The answers are anonymous. We'd appreciate your responses. So I think we're going to share that in the chat now as we continue this conversation. But we want to catch people before they head out. This is something that we do at the consent of the speakers. So they've agreed to let us do this.
Please give us actual feedback. We really want it. We want to make presentations better. We want to present the information in a helpful way. So the more feedback you're willing to give, we love it.
Right. There's one asterisk. We weren't able to figure out how to get actual text responses in this. So
okay, cool. Anytime you want. You can send us an email directly. No, you're good.
Please send an email. They were really curious to know exactly that, some detailed feedback. So if there's a way to send that to me, great. So I'm just gonna go through this.
We have a couple of questions, so just rate the extent to which you agree or disagree. I'm gonna leave this first question on for another few seconds, and we'll move on to the second, and then we finish.
Any other questions while we wait? We can answer for anybody.
Well, I really like the, I hope other people ask, but I really liked the conversation you had about culture, because I thought this is something that, you sort of take the culture of the agency where you are is sort of the starting point, and you can't really have a revolution to change that. But it sounds like culturally the Bureau was in a good place, so that was kind of an enabler for you. Because I realized that in some environments it can be there can be a little bit of a risk aversion that goes to the extent where you're not willing to take action. And so this is something that I was curious about, if there was any of this resistance in the, if there were pockets of institutional expertise that were saying, no, this is how we have to do it, or if that just wasn't a part of the picture.
Yeah, Kate, do you mind if I take that? So I would say that we describe the first years of XD's existence as the dark ages, because it was very challenging. I think, like, trying to stand up an organization kind of dedicated to looking at forward-thinking problems instead of like the challenges we face today is extraordinarily difficult. And it took us a while to kind of hone, as Kate mentioned, like we went through a few different mission statements and things of that nature. It took us a while to hone the messaging, to hone the portfolios of problems that the XD team's working on, to really understand, to really kind of understand what the sort of demand from different programs at Census Bureau was, and their appetite for experimentation, risk taking, and tackling forward-thinking problems. And I think that one of the challenges that we faced when we first were stood up is that we really didn't have, we kind of bounced around the Census Bureau. We didn't have like a specific home, and there wasn't like a really great place kind of set up to support this kind of work at the Census Bureau. And one of the things that we've been working on over the last few years is trying to create that home. And so earlier this year, so it was October, I took the Chief Innovation Officer role at the Census Bureau, and I think that is a direct response to the challenge of finding a home for innovation at the Bureau. And XD is one team that sits in this area now. There's another team called the Census Open Innovation Labs, who focuses a bit more on experimentation as it pertains to prize authority, capability, and other capabilities that you're trying to build out at Census. But I think that in both of those teams' experiences, the thing that they have very much in common, despite having very different expertise, is this notion that they want to work on really important forward-thinking problems, and they didn't have the kind of level of support needed to do so. And so these teams now have kind of converged under the Office of the Deputy Director, who is Ron Jarman for our Bureau, which is the senior most civil servant, non-political appointee in the Census Bureau. And I think that the optics of that sends a really important message to your organization. Like, where these teams sit is quite important. And it's not because you want to kind of flex your kind of seniority or lack thereof, if you will, in any given moment. But I think the notion of being kind of well poised to kind of deliver value to your enterprise equally is quite important. And there was no better place really for these teams to sit than in the Office of the Deputy Director to do that. And so I think the task over the next few months, few years, if you will, is in the same way that XD has kind of honed its value offerings and kind of really built a ton of really fantastic relationships with innovators across the Bureau to kind of cultivate these really great projects. I think now the task is to kind of stand up this office dedicated to innovation and what that looks like, and kind of defining not just what that looks like for XD and this other team I just mentioned, Coil, but what other teams should exist here, what other opportunities for innovation exist at the Bureau that should we exploring, and how can we incubate those in kind of a really healthy kind of innovation environment. And so that's the task ahead. So that's a really that's a really fantastic observation, and something that's a kind of challenge we're keen on solving over the next few months and years.
Wow, I gotta say, what a fantastic talk we've had. We are over time, and I appreciate Kate and Luke, both of you, for being willing to speak to this broad community that we have. I'm going to stop the recording now. We can